Hello everyone and welcome back to Backlog Banter. My name is Tucker Hazell and this is Dev Dive, a show where I get to talk to interesting game developers about their games, and today I've got a double hitter of the creators behind Thank Goodness You're Here. We have Mr. James Carbutt and Mr. Will Todd here to talk about the story behind the making of this game that is inching on being a year old, and we're going to explore all of that, and now they've kind of had some time to reflect on it. But Will and James, thank you very much for recording with me, for figuring out some time zone shenanigans, but we're here and we're ready to talk. How you feeling?
Good. Thanks for having us. Please don't say it's nearly a year old. That's harrowing.
Yeah, that's awful.
It's getting there. The two of you worked together on this game, as well as an older game that you made called The Good Time Garden. And this style of gameplay and animation seems to be something that you're comfortable with. But I want to know from each of you sort of what your history is with game design. Were there any projects you worked on before working together? And then how did you decide to end up working together?
Do you want to do the classic story, James?
Yeah, the spiel. Yeah, we don't really necessarily have any official game design industry experience. Me and Will were basically friends from school, and sort of friends turned enemies, turned friends again, turned game developer, co-developers, turned friends, turned closer friends.
And then eventually to enemies again.
That's enemies. And now I think we're settled on colleagues.
Yeah. Colleagues. Is good, yeah.
We didn't have any official industry experience, so yeah, we just did like a fun weekend project 5 years ago. And we got like a little bit of stuff from the Good Time Garden going, and then we just kept on that ball rolling until like a year had passed, and we had like a full game done basically, and released that for free. And then just hopping from there, basically, like that was kind of exciting enough for us to continue.
The Good Time Garden was supposed to be just like a weekend thing. We always joke it's like the fun weekend project that like lasted like 5-6 years. We just really enjoyed the process. Like we found ourselves at this point, like professionally, where we'd gone separate ways but had this complementary skill set. So we just wanted to like do something to get together, and we've always been into games. So we thought, and that's kind of what I've always wanted to do. I studied games at college and university. The first like day, we got this little goblin thing with his knob out, walking around on screen, all hooked up the gamepad and stuff. And that was like, I'd done game projects before, but that was the first time that I think I'd really enjoyed it, and we both like super enjoyed it. And they had this immediate feedback, and like it was sort of our kind of back and forth that we developed over however many years, then sort of applied to our respective disciplines and stuff. So we just fell in love with the process, and then wanted to really keep going with it. And like Jim says, after a year, we released the first thing, The Good Time Garden, that got a good enough reaction to spur us on to try and pitch for funding to do something to make the switch to full time, which was, thank goodness you're here.
Can you remember, Will, whose idea was the Fun Weekend project? Who's to blame for this?
It was you. It was your idea.
No.
I distinctly remember in the train station after like having hung out under some other context, and you was like, "Yeah, we should just do like a fun weekend game jam thing or something like that." And thus began the series of weekends in which you'd come to my place, forget your charger every time. We'd start the weekend by having to go to the shopping centre and buy another charger for your laptop.
I had like 4 chargers going at one point with like 4 different receipts. Yeah.
All your money was tied up in chargers. Yeah. Go back to that shop and return like 5 of them. Oh God.
Yeah, well, it's fun to hear that you started this just as a side project, but then enjoyed doing it so much and worked so well together, you were able to turn it into a full-time job and, of course, release a commercially released project, but that, by all accounts, has been very popular and successful, and people have really enjoyed it, and it seems like you enjoyed the process as well. But take me back to the first time that you remember thinking about taking on a major project that would be commercially released, that you would be putting a significant amount of time into, that would become Thank Goodness You're Here. Do you remember when that initial idea was, and what the initial ideas for Thank Goodness You're Here was?
It was before The Good Time Garden had come out, and we were talking about just other ideas and things that were getting us excited. It was very, very different back then. It was mainly oriented around this idea of like these like abstract visual compositions, like these really like intense, strange like perspective bits. It wasn't based on a northern town. I don't think there was any going to be like dialogue in it, really. We were just sort of like talking around this sort of like vague idea, and that very slowly developed over time. And it was like, it didn't even have a name then. And then when we started, it was called something else, and we got to the point where there was like a little character walking around, because originally there wasn't. It was going to be just like interactive vignettes where like you'd be presented with a scene and your input would be mapped to some random object in the environment. And it was all super like ethereal and wanky. And then we sort of like got drawn back into like maybe make it a bit more gamey. We had a little guy that ran around slapping things, and then the town and stuff like came about from just us doing the voices back to each other, and then it sounding like us in our accents. And then we eventually settled into the northern town.
I like that you mentioned the slapping as something that you implemented early on that kind of solidified this game's identity, because as I was playing the game, I just kept thinking to myself, what is the deal with the slapping? Do you remember whose idea it was or how you came up with the idea to have slapping be the main interactive mechanic? That's also kind of true in the Good Time Garden, but it's certainly more prominent in Thank Goodness You're Here. How did the slapping come about as like the main verb of this game?
I remember during the development of the Good Time Garden, basically the first idea that either of us had for a character or an environment, we would just put in because there was no stakes. So at some point, someone said like, "Oh, what if it's this guy who's got like a big butt and is like, woohoo, slap me?" That ended up being a character in the Good Time Garden, and then like so our main character then had to slap so you could slap him, and then I think we realized that it was a really nice sort of alternative to like press X to talk or like those kind of prompts, which we find like the non-diegetic stuff, like UI on the screen and stuff, really takes you out of the experience. So like a slap is like a really funny like way to like navigate that need for like a UI.
Well, it's a good way to get a character's attention, because ostensibly what you're doing in any video game when it's like press A or X to talk is you're like, hey, talk to me. You're poking them. You're getting their attention. But in this, you slap them across the side, you slap them across the face, and that's what gets their attention. And so it definitely adds a little bit more. It's violence, but it's silly violence, but it adds a different tenor to the way that you're interacting with the environment and the people in town.
Yeah, you're right. Like leading into that, because you play a game and you press X to talk, all you're basically doing is like prodding the non-playable character to like say something. So we like went into that. What if they reacted as if you were like bothering them? So I think we like kind of went into that.
But it also opens up the fact that it doesn't then have to be like a X to talk button. You don't then like necessarily like assume everyone's going to talk or everything's going to talk or have the same reaction. It's like it's an interact button, but then with a literal verb that means like there's like unexpected outcome, like something's going to like physically react to the thing you're doing, but like what consequences of that are can change depending on the context.
It's interesting, as I was finishing up the game, the genre and other kinds of games that it reminded me most closely of were point and click adventure games. Games like Grim Fandango or Leisure Suit Larry, games that have a sense of humor and use the point and click adventure structure of clicking on anything and having a pop up of dialogue. That would be where you get a lot of the jokes, a lot of the comedy comes from. And obviously, you're slapping in this game, but it is quite similar. You can slap anyone in the game and they'll give you some fun line of dialogue, or you can slap something in the environment. You can slap a box, a tree, whatever it is, and then it'll crumple, it'll have a little fun animation. And so, was that an intentional parallel to point and click adventure games? And if so, were there any point and click adventure games that you loved that might have inspired this game in some way?
I think there's maybe like a less intentional lineage there. We weren't looking to point and click adventure games as a point of reference, but I think it's maybe like it's hard to escape that too much when you have like a single verb and the way you interact with things that then has to like have cascading consequences and is used for everything. Yeah, like Monkey Island and stuff were are things people often make comparisons to. We haven't actually played those, which is really bad. I'm excited to play it though. I'm maybe nervous. I'm going to find that like, oh, we've actually just unintentionally just stolen all this style and sense of humor and sensibility.
So, if not point and click adventure games, do you remember any games that you were pulling inspiration from for the design of Thank Goodness You're Here?
I think a big one for me at least was Inside and Limbo. There's like
Sure.
a certain purity of like the control schemes there that feels super intuitive without the need for like front loading information, and definitely design the world to fit the player's like learning curve. So that was a big one I think in terms of actual design. And then I'm trying to think of like the spaces themselves. We're a lot more inspired by just like real spaces. So some of the time we're even drawing like top down, like aerial views of like a market to think like how would this layout work. And so I think a lot of that stuff is based off real life.
Yeah, Insides in particular was like a big point of reference. I remember us having like not an argument per se, a discussion about right at the start when you're in the salesman's office when you pop up. I thought maybe we just kind of have to concede that like we're gonna have to give the kind of controls on screen and like get them across to the player. And we're kind of going back and forth, and then I don't know which one of us said like what does inside do? How does that get it across? It's really organic and natural. You can open the pause menu and see it if you want, but it doesn't need to give you like the non-diegetic UI prompt. So we got that kind of settled it, and we thought let's not do it. Stick to the guns. In terms of like some of the design choices and like the world navigation, the big one for me was like Dark Souls, Bloodborne maybe more so because I guess that's just my favorite.
Good taste.
Oh yeah, the bangers in the From Software games like that. You come across these little doorways that seem insignificant, and you think, oh, maybe there's like, a bit of a chest hidden in here, and then you follow an alleyway, down past that door, and then down a ladder, and then out something, and then you're out in like a completely huge new area that's like the size of the map you've seen so far, and you're like, how is this down here? How is this like this obscure route to get to it? In particular, like Elden Ring does that a lot, I think. These really obscure little ways of getting to these massive open spaces. And so in the same way, we kind of did these little innocuous little throughways out round the side of a building, up some telegraph pole, across a roof, and it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And it feels like, oh, it might just be kind of like you can see yourself like hitting the dead end of like that route at any given point, but then it keeps going and keeps going, and then you pop out in a whole new space. That's kind of something we're really keen on, sort of like poking your way through these little bushes and then popping out, and there's a whole new thing in front of you.
Just like in Bloodborne.
Just like in Bloodborne.
Very
like
similar
Bloodborne.
games. Our game and Bloodborne.
Yeah. Well, I do actually think that the structure of the game is something that is really uncommon, because I remember when I first started up this game, I played it when it came out last year, and I couldn't really figure out in that first main area where I was supposed to go or what I was supposed to do or what would lead me to the next area. And of course, it is a convoluted sort of Rube Goldberg machine of like little tasks you have to do in order to move you forward. But I do think that over the course of the game, you settle into your game's rhythm. Is ostensibly, thank goodness you're here, operates in a loop. It's a circle of environments that connect back to one another. And you're right, it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But I like that, especially for the comedic tone of the game, you're able to use repetition through revisiting environments to create jokes. And so for the loop structure of the game, do you remember how you came to that being something that you would then loop through different environments? Go through the chimney multiple times, go through that buttery tube multiple times. Was that something that sort of came up as you were pacing the game, or was it something you intended from the beginning?
Yeah, that was a really tough one, wasn't it? I think when we first started designing the demos and stuff, we would be like, and then, so it'd be like, and then you go through this guy's bedroom, and then you fall out of a window, and then you're on the street. And then when it came to like extending that out to the full game, we ran into like quite a lot of difficulties, didn't we, Will?
Yeah, and I think we had to impose like a little bit of structure top down, because like largely they're processor driven, like Jim says. It's this intuitive thing where we do the silly voices to each other, derive a sketch, and then contrive gameplay out of that, and then try and like put that in a sort of linear sequence or linear-ish. But to define the sort of the scope of the space that we were building, we had to kind of have a top down X number of these, like what we call like overworld spaces, where they were like the more the top down view, and they're a little bit bigger, and things branch off from them, and they have the different rooms coming off them. So we sort of like designed, okay, they're going to be this number of rooms, and how do they, overworlds, how do they connect together? And something we wanted to do was make these little corridors. Everything in theory has like a joke play out over time. So every time you like come through, you get a new bit of thing. So we end up with this like big map of, I think they all connect to each other with one-way paths, which is really hard to like map out in your head, and no one ever made it make sense. But for almost like the entirety of production, the whole thing was like an open world where you could access that at any given time. As soon as you freed Charlie's hand from the grate and the sort of the buttery pipe opens up, you could then get to anywhere at any given time, which we always wanted to do. We thought it was going to be great to make an open world. Every time you come back here to a new space, there'll be something new to see, and that was sort of facilitated by this idea of like time progressing. I don't think we've spoke about this yet. It didn't really make it in the game, but there was a sort of an invisible hand of like hours and minutes, and hours would tick up every time you did a job, and minutes would tick up in a obfuscated way. It was when you like entered new spaces, but not like repeating going back in the same spaces. And so when minutes tick up, we'd have like, all right, new things happen within the hour, and I can already tell by the look in your face, it doesn't make any sense, and it was super convoluted to even for us to like get our head around. But the idea being like we could keep drip feeding, content to the player as they explore the world and do jobs in any different order. You basically, if you do that, you're gonna end up with a point where someone is gonna have like missed the primary objective they're supposed to be doing, and then exhausted every bit of space in the world, and now all those spaces are just empty. And you can go one side of this place and like, okay, I've been in the chippy now. Oh, there's nothing here. No one's saying anything now. And you go to the other side of the world now. I'm now in the pub, and no one's saying anything now here. And it just really sucks. And in playtesting, when we were finally doing playtests of like the builds that were playable because they had all the voice and a lot of the animation in, people just weren't getting it, and would do that and get stuck on these mad loops of like an hour at a time, just looping down the drain pipes and then down the other pipes and then up through another thing, but just missing that you were supposed to do the one thing next in the story. So much so that we had to just put the whole thing on rails. It was really difficult, but also kind of fun in a way. Task of taking this sort of like weird flowchart that opened up and then closed down again at the end, and just placing it all on like one big linear path, and figuring out how we'd lock up and then reopen these pathways, these throughways as we call them, over time, which is pretty hard. You could speak maybe more to that, James.
Yeah, we just ended up finding really stupid ways to like close off areas. So like when Charlie gets like stuck in the well, that's because we just had to stop the player going down there. So it's a really stupid way. We could have just put like a sign there, but instead it was like, let's animate a character and do a whole dialogue line of him going like, "Call the fire department." It's a stupid way of doing it, but it's also quite funny. The player doesn't. I think the player can kind of tell we've tried hard to block off these areas, and we're doing it with jokes, so they're like less upset.
Because everything is a joke in the game in some way, form, or fashion. The characters are always moving around, doing slightly different things. I never felt like it was a frustrating block off. It's like, well, that's just what happened. Like, and I need to
Yeah.
go somewhere else. It was never frustrating, as you said, because you got a joke out of it, and you're like, well, too
Yeah.
bad. Because that's kind of the vibe the game has, is everyone is kind of like ribbing one another and taking each other's stuff and like insulting each other. And so you're just a part of this big mess. And just being stopped is like, well, this is just a weird town. Like, okay, I guess these people are, stopping me from entering this hallway now.
Yeah. It's kind of nice. Like you hear a lot that like comedy is hard to do in games, and it is. But it gives us a lot of like leeway to just solve issues and like game design problems with just the stupidest answer. So it's quite liberating in that way. And I think it was a lesson that took us a long time to learn, that just like the easy and stupid solution is sometimes best.
Do you remember any particular jokes or clever solutions to a game design problem that you came up with that you are proud of and think are super funny?
I think the learner driver is a good repeating bit, which sort of is almost like a wink to the camera. Like you see them in like the illogical context, like the driving test is happening in a car park, and then they end up like jammed in an alleyway, which again sort of makes sense. But then they keep getting like jammed in like further alleyways and more contrived situations. But I think that was like I wouldn't call it elegant, but that was a kind of a satisfying solution to one of those problems.
You talk about the ways that you've learned different things over the course of making this game, but I'm also curious about the progression from the Good Time Garden and then into Thank Goodness You're Here. Was there any things that you remember learning while making the Good Time Garden as your first project, and then you're like, oh, we have to fix this when we move on to our next major thing?
Probably a lot of technical stuff, right? I think that's the biggest learning.
The Good Time Garden was sort of like held together by a lot of like duct tape behind the scenes. It just wasn't optimized at all. I just didn't know what I was doing. The whole thing just like immediately loads into memory. Like the negative reviews on that game are like, yeah, it just crashes on startup for me. It's because it just like on some laptops it just like melts it. There's just so much technical faff to game development, and a lot of it goes unseen, especially a project like at any sort of scale. And conceptually, like thank goodness is a small game, but yeah, so many things you can easily take for granted. And we did in terms of like design decisions, but then have these massive like rippling consequences. Like just no loading screens was something we both really wanted to do. That's really hard to do. It just means everything has to be like very delicately balanced and like streamed in and out as you're moving around the world. And if you know what you're doing, I'm sure it's not that hard. But yeah, like I say, I didn't know what I was doing, so I was just having to learn things on the fly, which was challenging, but also like quite satisfying to then solve those problems.
And you mentioned the scope of the game being deceptively complex, and I'm curious how you decided how big this of a project this was going to be. You know, you make your first game, which is a 15-20 minute free game, and thank goodness you're here, is many times larger than that. Do you remember sitting down and thinking of like, okay, how much time are we going to put into this? How many areas are we going to have? Did you have a runtime in mind? How did you manage sort of the scope of this project to make sure it was within your reach, but also, made you feel fulfilled?
He's just
Yeah,
laughing
we
at
didn't
that.
do that.
Yeah, we just didn't. We just didn't. Off the back of the Good Time Garden, we were operating under the illusion that, like, all right, when we go full time on something, and also now have a bit of experience at how to actually make a game, we'll be able to like do things way faster. And we were talking at one point about 24 hours of playtime.
What the heck?
Maybe we just said that out loud, and it was never really like thought
Yeah.
upon. But that obviously got like more realistic. But there were points at which we were like, when we were in the more serious talks about pitching and in conversations with publishers, we were looking at like, okay, if how long does it take to do a character? How long does it take to do like an area? Okay, add all those up and make work weeks out of those. Put all those out in front of each other. Oh, it's going to take 10 years. Okay, and then we had to like set expectations with the publishers and be like, look, this isn't going to be, a mammoth thing. It's going to be fairly small. And I think the amount we sort of settled on at that point was 4 hours, which it's very much not. Kind of weirdly, like the Good Time Garden took about a year, even though it was part time, to make a 30-minute experience, and thank goodness was 4 years to make a 2-hour experience. So we should have just taken that metric and just thought, all right, well, yeah, let's just scale it up linearly, and then yeah, unfortunately that was the case.
But again, you think full time, that's going to be twice as fast. But somehow it's just not true. I don't know what happens. We should have kept on our full time jobs, Will. We should have stayed at Bargain Boom.
Yeah.
We got it done in a year.
yeah.
Well, what happened is that thank goodness you're here is a much more complicated game. There's a lot more moving things in the environment. There's a lot more voice acting. There's a lot more characters, a lot more animations. Like that's where the real detail oriented time comes from. And I think why thank goodness you're here feels so satisfying to play, even though it is only about 2 hours long, is because it's so dense. Is you can, if you want, go to every little thing and watch the little animation of the worm, and you can get all the voice lines out of people. It feels like there's a lot of content and ideas packed into such a small runtime. I played through the Good Time Garden this morning. Obviously, a lot less options, a lot less voice lines. It's a different scope of project in terms of density, even though like how long the actual full experiences might be like, relatively still small. It's much more dense.
Yeah, that was very intentional, I think.
Yeah, there's something that's intentional, but also strangely to us, it doesn't necessarily feel so. I think because we're blind to some of the things and blind to the pace of it because it's us as we've done it like over a very long period of time. So when people say things like, even pre-release, they were like, "Yeah, you're not gonna put too much more in now, are you? Because it feels like that would be too much." We go, well, there's still this little blank spot over here. What about when we put something in that? But if you're seeing it fresh all for the first time, then it's the brain takes some time to like process it and like take it all in. And I think there's a point of like diminishing returns when you oversaturate the player to the point where it's like things stop going in and your brain sort of like starts deprioritizing stuff, maybe the wrong stuff, and you miss some of the good bits.
You mentioned pitching this game to publishers and it being something that you sort of had to work on over time to make sure that you were properly setting their expectations for what this project was going to be. Do you remember what that pitching process was like from especially the very earliest times you were trying to pitch it? What did you say, like, this is what this game is, and here's why you should be interested in publishing it? Because it is a really unique and kind of bizarre project, and so I can't even imagine, like, writing that pitch deck and pitching it to people what it was like.
I think for all of our faults, pitching we were quite good at. We just got some of the numbers wrong. But the actual vibe and tone of the game we were quite good at expressing, and we also like really over-egged this demo that kind of like showed you what a sequence might look like, which took a long time to build. But we did a lot of the hard work so that there was not too many questions for the publishers after we gave them the pitch deck and the demo.
I think it kind of went one or two ways. People either just didn't get it at all and were like, this doesn't fit in sort of our catalogue, we don't understand what genre it is, and those talks ended pretty quickly. Or people were excited about it, they could see what we were trying to do, but it was more a case of figuring out the numbers and stuff that didn't work. It wasn't really dismissed out of hand too at all, really. I think there were a few people that like, oh, we're not signing anything right now. We were very confident about the pitch deck and the demo. Like that was super, super tight. Again, we didn't know what we wanted in terms of like the numbers and the scope we were under that, but we sort of knew kind of what we wanted out of a deal and out of a partner, which is super important. I think we probably stopped a few when it was clear that they weren't getting what we were putting down. There were a lot of bad publishers, I think.
Every interview is like,
yeah.
Careful,
very
careful.
kids. Don't get stung. It's true. It's true. It's true. It's really important, I think, especially in recent times where it's like very hard to get your hands on money. I think it's people will be like, champing at the bit to get any sort of deal, but bad deal is definitely worse than no deal.
There's some scoundrels out there, definitely.
There's your advice if you're trying to pitch a game for the first time. There are bad publishers out there, and don't just jump straight to conclusions.
Yeah, just be worried. Just be concerned.
Have background dread guide your every decision. It's worked great for us so far.
Shifting gears a little bit, I am curious about this main character that you play as. There's this little squat yellow guy with bright orange hair that is goofy and silly and I think very iconic and unique in his own way. And I'm really curious about this guy because you don't get any information about him within the game. And sort of from a development background perspective, this character does it have a name that you called him? And how did you sort of have the idea for him to be super malleable? Like he can be bigger, he can be smaller, he can just fit into any situation. What was the development of the main character's process like? And specifically, is there something that you called him as like a code name or a name?
There is, yeah, but we it's secret.
Okay, fair enough.
I think there were a lot of iterations on the character design, I think, right?
Yeah.
And I remember one, there's just like a JPEG of him that I used as like the motionless like placeholder in creating the platformer controller in the very early demo, where he looks more or less like the little guy from The Good Time Garden. He's got the same nose and the same features, and he's in like dungarees. And he was in workwear for quite a while. There was an idea that like the salesman would arrive in the town and then slip into the role of like the odd jobs guy in a more sort of like structured way. There'd be this sort of like other character that would introduce you to the town, and you'd sort of end up slipping into his overalls. So you'd go from like the suit and tie to the workwear, and then naturally you're the town handyman now. So that's why you kind of get asked to do all the different things. Why do we take that? I think it felt like there were too many like starts. I think so because we had like the cold open with the TV adverts. We had in the salesman's office, the shop, the tower thing, and then the kind of musical live action interlude, and then in the mayor's reception, and then if we had anything more than that, we felt like, okay, this is like, we're losing momentum here instead of building it. So we streamlined that. Also, I don't think we didn't want to redraw the character controller in two different outfits. I think that was like a non-trivial part of it as well.
Yeah. James, do you have any memories about making this main character? How did you decide to be able to make him sort of shrink and grow as you pleased?
We spoke about the early idea being like loads of these interactive vignettes. So it would be like you'd control someone's hand putting a sausage in a Yorkshire pudding or something. So, and then maybe you'd see like a big head and like a little character would pop in and out of the ear and eyes and stuff. So I think we wanted to keep some of that weird visual composition stuff because the game is sort of just a sort of sketch show or a sitcom. A lot of the shots look like cartoon shots, right? So it's like mid shots and then close-ups of the face and then like far away shots. So to achieve that, the camera has to zoom in, which means like, does our player character then, is he also as big as them? Because that would feel weird, right? To control a character that's like 2/3 of the screen. So I think in part it came from that need to just like achieve these camera angles. So that means that the player character kind of like they never actually change. It's just stuff around them that changes, I guess.
Yeah, there's only really 2 or 3 different versions of the character actually. There's his walking on the sides. There's his top down, which is basically the same, and then the little one.
Yeah.
The really small one that doesn't really have like any features.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it was very important to keep the player character as like malleable and personalityless as possible because he represents the player, and the player in the game is the straight man. and in comedy you need a straight man. So
Sure. Yeah. And was there anything for the comedic writing of the game? Did you have like a process that you went through to make sure that these were as funny as you wanted them to be? And then how did you sort of decide this is where a joke should go, or this is where we should maybe leave a little bit of space to have a little downtime?
It was more the other way around. It was more that we just come up with bits and then figure out, okay, where does this
yeah,
go? We didn't really write it like a TV show. It was a strange sort of like naturalistic process where we would just like shout things back and forth to each other. If it kept making us laugh over like a period of days and weeks, then it was like assumed that it's kind of going in, and we're figuring out a way to make it work, and where to hang other things around it. But there were sometimes instances where we're like, okay, there's a bit of blank space here, let's just put something in. But there wasn't a lot of like editorializing anything. There wasn't
workshopping
workshopping
stuff.
too much. Yeah, we had a fairly good process at one point where we could just almost record dialogue almost like straight into the game engine. So we could have a character, we'd drop him in. I just record the stuff like on the spot, like a scrappy take, and then put that in, and then just mark that file as like, okay, in a later recording session, we need to do like a clean take of that when we're in a sound studio. I do things sometimes where I just like, all right, I'm going to put the worm popping out here as a surprise for James, and he's just going to say something funny this time, and then you kind of do this same thing back to me. So we almost like just go off and do our own thing and just wang things in there willy nilly.
Yeah, that was the beauty of it taking so long to make as well, is that we didn't like a lot of the like bits when we came to record them were refined because we've been saying them back and forth for the past like 3 years. So that was quite nice. It's a bit like, I guess, when you make your first album, you know, you kind of have so much stuff in the backlog that you just can kind of pluck from this like a bunch of ideas, whatever. So that was quite nice too.
We talk about these jokes that are more written and lots of dialogue and stuff. But again, another thing that I say gives this game a sort of a density is that there's a lot of very small visual gags. There's a lot of funny little brands. There's a lot of funny graffiti and signs and things like that. And I really enjoyed that. And I'm curious for each of you, was there any fun brands or fun little graffiti things that you were like, oh, this is really silly. I'm really glad I added this in the game.
Maybe the funny ones are ones you did, James. I think the sort of like the signage and stuff was often you that you did. That would just be something that you just stick in. I'd be like, yeah, perfect. But there'd be times where you'd be like, oh, what's the brand of cigarettes? And I'd just be like, Tickler's Choice, and it just like it just come from like a deep place. I don't know what it is. I don't know why that works so well. I don't know if it does work well. It just feels fantastic to me. It's I don't know.
It's great.
We just sort of like go with this sort of stuff, and I think that's like, yeah, it's great to have that gut feel for something and then see it come to life, and then come to life in like very weird ways. And then there's adverts for it, and then and now it's a background prop. Now maybe someone mentions it somewhere.
That's really fun when you build on it and like then someone like references it. Like Peens started out as like a spelling mistake on a post-it note on the wall, which is really embarrassing. That like one of the things people quote the most is like something we didn't really write. We just accidentally put in.
Well, I think you probably just realize that it is silly enough and it has a unique enough identity that you certainly did focus on it. And I think that's probably why people quote it so much, is it's in that opening advertisement, and then also there's Peens cans everywhere. Characters talk about Peens, and it just sounds dumb and silly. And so that's certainly one of my favorites.
It's a good one. There's more stuff with Peens as well that we didn't manage to get in, like it being a hair care product at some point as well. Like it. Also, like not being quite clear what it is as well. Is it a foodstuff? Is it not fit for human consumption?
Is it health?
Yeah.
Is it medicine?
Yeah.
One of my favorite little signs is the one that says like no jokes between 9 a.m. and 9 and 17 or something like that. Like it just why? Yeah. Why is that there? Who knows? It's just really silly.
There's also, like, I don't know. People haven't really clocked it, but some of them change around based on like sort of random values we set at the start of the game. Like some people get like slightly different playthroughs. Not enough for it to be like interesting and noticeable. Enough for us to like, I don't know, have had the idea and then sort of lost momentum with it halfway through.
There's a couple of things we didn't quite manage to squeeze in. Like for an example, if you go into Price Shaggers at the back, there's like that double-ended mops thing, and they're like a classic thing in the UK is this company called JML, and they're like, I guess what's the American version, Will? As seen on TV, I think it's called.
Or maybe, yeah. It's like teleshopping, right? It's a brand that does like very teleshopping based things, but they also have would have like a physical presence in shops, and there'd be like a the stands with
The TV would blast out something,
the
yeah,
steam cleaner, and
like
then
new from JML, the Sponge Daddy. Put it in your mouth and you'll dry up in 10. And it's like, what is this for? There was those kind of things.
Yeah. I mean, some of that energy comes from that beginning when you have all those little animated commercials that kind of set the tone. And I'm curious about the opening to the game because you mentioned that you had sort of had to trim it back and you definitely didn't want it to go on for too long. I've never really seen a game open on advertisements. And so how did you decide that this was going to be something that was going to be a tone setter for the game of like, ads are something that we like in the game. Here are advertisements for these products that you're then going to be seeing in repeated bits. It's very, very unique.
I think it's unique for games, but I don't know if it's all that unique in like media and like films and TV. I wouldn't say it's tired, but it's like I think it's a fairly common way to start something like in kind of media
yeah,
res.
maybe a bit of a trope. Like opening on the TV, not quite that opening on like the news report that gives you the full exposition for how
Yeah,
monkeys have taken over the world or
zooming
something.
fully out.
Maybe came in part from there's a very very early ideas that like, and I still love this idea, and it's a shame we couldn't make it work. But like you open the game after having like started and come back, and instead of like being met with a menu, you sort of like met with like one of these adverts. There's like a snippet of something or something plays out. You know what's happening, and then that cuts away, and then it somehow cuts back into where you were in the world, or like I don't know, like the idea that we cut to like a conversation happening, and then the player character eventually like runs and like slaps against the window, and now you're controlling him, and now it's and now you're back into the scene. But that sort of stuff's like really cool and interesting in theory until you come down to like have to do all right, now we have to do like 50 of these brand new scenes that in theory
Yeah,
the player's never going to see if they just like start and finish the game in one sitting, this kind of stuff. So you kind of, when it comes to like cutting the fat, you have to get rid of those things. But the TV stuff I think also is just that sort of like formula is like really good for the sketch stuff, especially just literally like flipping through channels is basically like what we want to do. We'd love to do something that is just that. It's just like something that starts like already like in media res, and then finishes before you even get to like a punchline really, and then just like keep hitting the audience with more and more of those. And that's all we do if we could get away with it. But I suppose 4 or 5 at the start as a cold open is the best we could get away with.
I think that did kind of impact the structure of the game a little bit though, because you have these like title cards when you finish an episode of the game. You finish sort of a mini story arc. It like a group of people like say the name of this is what the chapter was called, and for that it really feels to me like you're switching to the next channel. You're switching to the next section of the game, and so that structurally I think that did find its way in a little bit.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think that's something that hung over that sort of feeling. Yeah.
Finally, I kind of want to talk a little bit about Barnsworth, this town that the game is set in, and what went into, especially the architectural design and the clutter and all of this stuff, visually designed. What kind of research did you do? Like, did you go take photos? Did you like look up different brands to use as references? What was that research process like to make it feel authentic and unique?
well, I mean, like the game is based off of Barnsley, which is our hometown. So I guess just like 18 years of being brought up in like a post-industrial, yeah, we just lived the experience, man. It's real, dude. So it was like if I'm gonna draw like a grit bin or a lamppost, it's like, well, I'll just draw the ones I remember. It's sort of inspired by the 1970s and like an imagined Barnsley. So like there's lots of films out there, like archival footage, and also there's just a film, Kes.
Oh,
If you've
sure.
seen
Yeah,
Kes,
yeah.
it's about
Mhm.
a boy and his bird. That's set in Barnsley, so like watching those kind of films was like big inspiration too.
Do you remember any particular element that from your real life that you were like, oh, we need to translate into this into the game to make sure it feels sort of accurate to our hometown?
Grit bins. Grit bins are like, for some reason, like a very notable like street architecture there. I think about a lot. I don't know why. Like they're just like yellow bins that are full of grit for when it snows. You just like cover the road in.
I suppose things like the town hall and stuff. It's based on Barnsley Town Hall, but
Yeah.
also we did look at a lot of like other similar towns and villages for like points of reference, because it's not like a one for one. There's not like any particular street that's like, oh, here is a literal transliteration almost of this real life street or anything. which would have been cool, but like for design constraints and stuff, and we didn't want to have to like make real big logical sense. Like if we made like the streets life size, then it'd be like I don't know 50 houses that we'd have to have interactive doors on or whatever. I just lost that train of thought. I don't know. Sounded like I was saying something interesting, didn't it? But yeah.
It had the cadence of something quite intellectual.
Yeah.
I think some of the backgrounds as well have like you can see like peaks of the moors and of like the rolling hills, and that's like something that I miss about the north of England, where you feel like you could be in the town centre or you can be in a residential bit, and if you just sort of squeeze a look between two houses, you can kind of see some of the beautiful landscape, and I think that's something we try to squeeze into.
Well, I mean, I think you succeeded in making something that is totally unique, especially for a video game. We don't get a ton of video games that are based on Britain, especially not on like out in a smaller town that people aren't as familiar with. And so from all the research that I've done, all the people that I've heard talk about this game, people feel like they've gotten a snippet of culture of a place that a lot of people haven't been. And so I really do think you succeeded on that, and I want to thank you both for joining me and talking about the story behind this game, what went into your inspirations and the design process. Are there any final thoughts before you close out in this interview?
No, put a shrew in a shoe.
Okay, all right, that's a piece of advice.
Don't put that in, please.
All right, well, thank you very much both for joining me, and for everyone else, stick around on Backlog Banter for more dev dives, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Ducker. Cheers for having us. Thank you for your kind words and good questions.
Thanks for having us.